Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval free companies, especially during the crucial knot, so to say, of the second half of the 14th century, at the beginning of the 15th as well. Free companies, soldiers of fortune, there are different ways to term what is effectively an informal system, an informal institution, reflecting one actually of the darkest periods of the otherwise not so dark medieval period and medieval warfare as well, for reasons that we will try to explain today. This is not the first time we discuss, of course, such things like free companies, medieval mercenaries. I made also recently more videos about the condottieri. Today we will not look at, first of all, we will not finish the video because this is just like a broader introduction to all the, at least the more famous, or sometimes not so famous but still important, relevant mercenaries, free companies, leaders of this era for the sake of completion. However, we will not, for example, discuss some of the major companies of the era, the most famous one being, the most effective one as well, being the White Company, John Oakwood. We will make multiple videos just about that because it's just a chapter on its own. We will not talk too much about the same Italian condotta during the same period. We will not look at Italy in general. The condottieri at this time were largely foreign in the various sort of phases of Italian mercenarism during the Middle Ages. We will concentrate on the westernmost part of Europe, namely France. That was the great battlefield of this era. There would be so much to say about Germany as well. Obviously, we will talk about Englishmen, Occitanians, even Spaniards. But what is happening in the second half of the 14th century, which I hope to have explained satisfactorily enough, even though just in this introductory way, was a moment of deep crisis, right? Talking about the free companies is in many ways to look at a period that is relatively similar to ours, at least as far as destabilization, stagnation, crisis, political unhingement of alliances, of axes, etc. That is sometimes, I would say, not just apparent, but however not really altering the very fundamentals of the system. As you know, I specialize specifically, my doctoral research was on the first half of the 14th century, Western European tactics specifically, but looking at also tendentially more things about the mid-14th century as well, because normally people who study the early 14th century stop to the first few decades and mostly come from the mid-13th century. I instead really just expanded mostly. I studied the end of the 13th century as well, but expanded mostly in this first half, which is often not didactically scanned in this way. I admit that one of the reasons was incredibly banal and pragmatic, if anything, but I'm not going to discuss this today. And so I have had this privileged perspective. It's like, I don't know, to make a fitting example, it's like studying, I don't know, when we study Roman history, say the early empire, normally people study the Golden Age, if you listen to Meyerbeer and so on. It's all the great period, the Antonines, just even this first, say, decades of the 3rd century before the 3rd century crisis proper, right? Instead, it's as if I had studied just like from the Antonines to the heat of the crisis, mostly being about the early 3rd century. Comparatively, that's the moment. And I've said it often that this first half of the 14th century and mid 14th is a very similar period to ours. If anything, very similar. Today we talk again about the second half of the 14th century because we have been living through the peak, through the last expansive and in part stagnating phase of a great civilizational expansion. We cannot predict, of course, what was going to happen and how, but there are certain phenomena, certain dynamics that that help me dramatically, like in understanding today's world by studying that very period in medieval politics and warfare, right? History rhymes rather than repeating itself. That's the cliche, etc. But it is correct to an extent. And among other things, I discovered in many ways that this period of greater upheaval is, of course, different for different countries, but at large, the posthumes of the Black Death are really impacting the entire system all across Eurasia. And there are very similar dynamics. So a generalized decline, contraction, erosion of public authority, oligarchization, privatization, which the free companies in a sense represent, because there is a great deal of further fragmentation, or at least of shrinking of individual powers, also compared from the broader universal horizon to something more provincial and circumscribed, but at the same time more compact, actually developing some some sounder local bases, so to say, and yet in this very sense actually having very good means that, especially in the 15th century, would have, but already from the end of the 14th, would have allowed actually for a pretty strong consolidation and re-expansion. This is, in fact, as we'll partly see in this video and the various parts I will make, because again it's too long just for one, to end the period of the free companies. That in this sense, always remember the Clausewitzian definition of war instrumentally to politics, were in a sense not really a background noise, but something that was very often weaponized, in fact, by the same politics against one another, rather than bringing here some sort of truly free companies or random war bands that were just crossing Europe without any control, as if the local polities were just passively suffering. This is a very common view, or at least when in this period especially, it's difficult not to see the general crisis, the general destabilization to which these free companies did definitely contribute. But it's not the end of the world, literally. It's not the end of civilization. It's not the end of order. On the contrary, it's actually a precondition for reconsolidating an order that very often, and especially in this time, actually consolidates even more strongly from those countries who had previously consolidated the bigger civilizational capacities. Of course, with different outcomes later on, but let's say those who were backwards before did not really make a leap forward. They degenerated further. And this is my, in fact, insight on this apparent, like, a civilization is in crisis, so necessarily there is another system that takes over. No, it doesn't happen historically, right? You can have, at worst, like some kind of collapse and further hybrid, but it's not because from the other side there is actually a counter-alter to this kind of civilization. It's just everybody losing, and these sort of declining dynamics being very well evident, especially for those that seem to be more aggressive in that sense, exactly because they're hungrier, angrier for having remained backwards, but really not going too far. In the video about the condottieri, by the way, I explained this not just relatively to Italy, but also Germany, that, as you know, provided with the majority of mercenary troops in the first half of the 14th century to the mid-14th century. Again, today we will not talk about Italy that much, but we will make some reference to figures like, I don't know, von Urslingen, for example. We will not talk about Conrad of Landau, etc. Those we will cover in another video. Again, the White Company especially really deserves, but also the Great One of the 40s is really important. Today we stick most to this Atlantic scenario, rather. that was indeed very deeply interconnected, especially with Italy, because again, this was the axis that normally represents the real affluence of the system, and where there was more to gain in many ways, and where you understand that political manipulation actually was at the highest, rather than being here like a sort of anarchic world. We will talk more about Spain too, because just recently we talked again about the consequences of Najera. We made a video about the Spanish and Portuguese military organization was heavily influenced by, as we've seen, by the Anglo-French companies, models that were actually very advanced. Even, this is very important to frame that, even within this context of fragmentation and sort of privatization, apparent collapse of civilization, loss of power, actually these companies were maintaining the standards that they were the same people, like the same best military that countries like France and England had been using against one another. Since we will start here with the Truce of Bordeaux in 1357, I cannot avoid to recommend you as an intro to this series my video about the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. It's one of the single most beautiful battles that I have ever had the pleasure of reconstructing. That's a tactical base video on the sources, and so directly explaining what happened in that battle, that also dismantles many myths, including the one of the longbow, meaning you do not really need a longbow for such an extraordinary English victory, because it's not about technology, it's about much else, morale, leadership, and also luck to an extent. But it's literally one of the single most beautiful battles, the masterpiece of the Black Prince, and more. So I'm looking forward also. We will cover all the 100 Years' War battles in the same detail. It just didn't happen too often. We talked about Formigny. I think that those were the only two we made, which is weird. Battles videos do not happen more frequently than others, but that's also because, as you know, that's what I do for a living. I reconstruct battles, and I like, for that reason, to get all the primary sources and the best secondary literature on the topic in order to make a video on it. As I was hinting at before, I do not plan to conclude this video in just one episode, because I decided to explain this chapter in medieval military history by also focusing on, say, the bibliographical notes, say the military curriculum, so to say, of the various companies' commanders. So showing this systemic dynamic, but also focusing also on the individual stories of these individuals, which I thought to be exactly very useful in virtue of the plurality, the large amount of these figures incarnating a bit the same disorder, the same chaos that they procured in so many areas, and so emphasizing the sense of collapse, especially in France, that, however, again, not just was to win the war in the end, but displayed certain characteristics, certain features as a state, unlike practically any other country in Europe, that did manage to withstand the incredibly heavy blows that they suffered in open field, with major losses, including the ones of their monarchs, of essentially the royal armies, repeatedly against the English, and that, however, are not just the entire story. Made multiple videos about the French army of the 100 Years' War, also a bit one of the 15th century, the emergence of this so-called permanent nuclei, at least, of armed forces that actually were already there in other places as well. We observed that thoroughly for especially the northern Italian signories and their enormous forces. They, if anything, did inspire the French ones, as Comines explicitly mentions. In any case, let's simply get into it, and let's approach three companies on Schwerpunkt openly for the first time, in a comprehensive way. During the 100 Years' War, the earliest free companies emerged from soldiers who continued to bear arms after the aforementioned Truce of Bordeaux in 1357 and the subsequent Treaty of Bretigny in 1360. The Truce of Bordeaux had been a temporary ceasefire between England and France following the capture of King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers. Negotiated by the Black Prince Edward of Woodstock, it aimed to pose hostilities, while terms for a more permanent peace were worked out. And in fact, the Treaty of Bretigny took this a step further. It was a formal peace agreement that ended the first phase of the 100 Years' War. England gained substantial territories like Aquitaine, in her broader sense, in exchange for Edward III, King of England, renouncing his claim to the French throne, and John II was to be ransomed. While it brought to a lull, essentially, in state-sponsored warfare, the treaty, however, didn't disband the armies or address the thousands of armed men now scattered across France. This is a majorly shared dynamic across Europe. I personally studied a big deal at the beginning of this phase, especially the 40s, in other regions of Europe, and essentially the main problem that is inherently political, even more than anything else, even economic or whatever, it's all baked into it, but there is a deliberate choice to simply stop paying these extremely expensive forces that in the previous generations, as you know, in European warfare, have become ever more efficient, professional, expensive, really heavy. Also, from a technical point of view, we're talking mostly men-at-arms with essentially ever lighter retinues, at least in as much as heavy infantry as the expression of the communes, some peasant rebels, etc., had actually faded in the previous decades because of the plague, but not only, right? A general exhaustion of the system, and actually paved the way for the Black Death, was probably, rather than being simply invested by this random bacillum out there. And these politics, at some point, rather than thinking how to dismantle these troops, they say, you know what, you're on your own, we stop paying you, we don't have any need specific, also because they didn't really have the money in many ways, but they could have found some different solutions. But what better solution was there to throw these guys at enemies, and given especially the general upheaval of the system, a general crisis following the war, plague. Naturally, the concept of free companies highlights, especially in many parts of France, because that's really the place where the public collapse is sort of more evident of all. This Leviathanic system, the greatest state, the greatest power in Europe, that for this reason had also great systemic structural imbalances and shortcoming during the crisis and after these defeats, so that many areas of the country that had been previously essentially disarmed by the same French monarchy, not to be much of an effective force on their own, given that power concentration become the prey of these free companies. But at large, there is a huge market, there is a huge political work behind where to send and how to use these forces indirectly, right? Sponsoring them in a way or another. These free companies are never sort of completely on their own. This is not really the picture. We're not in the migration era, not even at the time, by the way. In fact, things were that random. Now, the origins of these groups are succinctly captured in the account of Basco de Mauléon, a commander of a free company who was interviewed by Froissart in 1388. I made an entire video about Jean Froissart, that is the greatest medieval French chronicler. He was actually Flemish, but he wrote in French. He wrote at the English as well as the French court. He's one of it is actually the greatest source of the 100 Years' War. As we will see later on, his chronicle was also continued. He died essentially at the beginning of the 15th century. And according to Froissart, that had interviewed the guy, so Froissart is very central in these times and places. Again, 100 Years' War, France, England, he knew his deal, regardless of his genre, the way he wrote, the purpose overall. It's another story, but he's a great source. And this Mauléon says, after peace was established, this is after Bretigny, was established between the two kings, all soldiers and companions were instructed to vacate the fortresses and castles they occupied, because many were garrisons, commanders, right? As a result, various soldiers and companions converged, and their leaders deliberated on their next course of action. They concluded, although the kings have reached an accord, we still require means to sustain ourselves, right? And you have an idea what fundamentally starts happening from this moment on. But let's start from Basco de Mauléon as an example of these free company commanders. He's a fascinating character, a Gascon soldier and mercenary whose life offers a gritty window into the chaotic world of the 100 Years' War at large, because that's always the backdrop, right? It's not like the war is really ever over. In fact, these free companies, again, are still to be considered within the balance also what this broader conflict and its ramifications that we call the 100 Years' War. Mauléon is best known through the aforementioned chronicles of Jean Froissart, who met him in 1388 at the court of Gaston Phoebus, Count of Foix, in Orthe. Froissart paints him as a seasoned man at arms, around 50 years old. This is interesting also, and tropically speaking. Arriving in style with a retinue fit for a baron, think-led horses and servants dining off gold and silver plate. Remember the oligarchization of the system. Remember the collapse of essentially the fourth estate here and the increasing elite professionalization of the military, as well as its numerical shrinking as well. Mauléon, his name Basco, likely ties to his Basque roots. I made a video about the Bide words, many of them coming from the same eras. Talk more about Basque warfare. I'm making a series about Navarre, by the way. If you're interested, you can check that out. His name Mauléon comes from the Sul region as well. This is a town, so he took the name after it. Though Basco might also hint at a nickname common among mercenaries, possibly meaning the Basque, or even bastard, that we will see was a very important, almost official title, exactly also among free companies commanders, in some dialects at least, suggesting Mauléon could have been an illegitimate son carving his own path, which was in fact the career of many of such figures. A career that, in the case of Mauléon, kicked off in 1356 at the same Battle of Poitiers. We mentioned Mauléon among the troops fighting under Captal de Boucq. These were essentially Occitanian forces serving the English. In fact, rather than English, the majority of the army was made up of Aquitanians, so to say. There, Mauléon made his first mark by capturing a knight and two squires, netting him a cool 4,000 francs in ransoms, a sign of his knack for turning war into profit. From then on, he bounced between loyalties, calling himself a, quote, loyal Englishman, despite his Gascon origins, because of this, again, old connection of the region with England, mostly in this centrifugal force from the concentration of the northern French monarchic power. Mauléon joined the free companies. At this point, bands of fighters left jobless after peace deals like the effect Bretigny in 1360. These groups didn't care much for treaties. They lived by the sword, raiding wherever they could. Basco bragged about commanding thousands, up to 12,000 in Burgundy specifically, including 3,000 to 4,000 top-notch men at arms, skilled at ambushes, sieges, and scaling castle walls, which is normal. I made some videos about specific men-at-arms of the period. We looked at Gunther von Schwarzburg. We looked at some English men-at-arms, mostly for the Arms and Armor historical military unit series, but that gives you an idea of who these people were, what they did. These were essentially the stormtroopers of the situation. Like, these were the guys who stormed the enemy walls, who had a general understanding of how to command his lighter, their lighter company elements. They were the backbone of this military, the same guys that clashed as heavy infantry or cavalry against one another in open field, right? So really the most important component. Mauléon's exploits were wild. He claimed to have extorted 60,000 francs from the Pope d'Avignon, quote, ransoming the whole country around it. He fought at the Battle of Brignais in 1362. These are all clashes we will see. We can't simply digress on them anyway. On this occasion, the companies smashed a royal army. Mauléon pulled off cunning tricks like disguising himself as a woman to seize the castle of Thury, which he said netted him 100,000 francs. This is a bit too much bragging, frankly, but it also gives you a sort of graphic idea of how much devastation and lack of authority could really bring to this, especially in central, southern France. In fact, for Mauléon, it wasn't all glory. Rivals like Limousin ambushed him in 1365, and he faced setbacks like when Sancerre's garrison foiled a raid he had planned with Sir John Emery, that we will talk about probably at the end of the series. Basco's life was a roller coaster of poverty and riches, as it was typically normal for the men-at-arms of the period. It was sort of a better life than a peasant's, but it had lots of ups and downs. There wasn't just a quick way to wealth. Plus, as we'll see now, this lifestyle was incredibly risky. Again, the notion that men-at-arms had it easier because they simply ransomed one another is really not reflective of the actual military reality. Froissart, again, is the source of election for Mauléon as for other free companies, commanders. Sometimes he didn't even have a horse himself. Other times, Mauléon was flush with cash. He embodied the restless, opportunistic spirit of the routier, meaning men who thrived in war's chaos, unbounded by peace. Whether every tale that he spun was true is, of course, debated. Some historians once thought Froissart might have invented the same Mauléon, but records of a Basco de Mauléon holding a fortress under English authority suggest he was definitely real, just maybe a bit prone to exaggeration. Either way, he is a vivid snapshot of a soldier who turned a brutal era into his personal playground, as many of his colleagues. Regarding the quasi-fairy tale historical recording of these figures, of course, you can check out that Froissart video that explains the, of course, courtly chivalric mindset from which this author would describe this figures, these commanders. Generally speaking, England, France. Here you have also the rise of Burgundy. It's different courts that were very much soaked into this very elitistic culture that was, in a sense, literally self-referential to the point of telling history as if it were, in fact, fairy tales of chivalric epos or something of this kind. But we do understand that such men-at-arms were very often that very embodiment of knightly and, in fact, militaristic lifestyle that we described in many videos. Will come back not just on this period, hopefully soon, but also and especially on this very heart of what we understand more concretely as Western feudal culture, molding, in fact, also in terms of literary genres and tastes, the rest of Latin Christendom. In any case, even when some stories may sound exaggerated, and that they still are reflective of the actuality of warfare in these times. And so the hyperbolical and rocambolesque sort of vicissitudes of these warriors is somehow spot on. Each band of companions, or routiers, known as rutters in English, would choose its own territory to plunder or extort for a consistent income. This is typical behavior, almost like a mafia territorial sharing, in part because there was a fierce competition between the same groups of armed veterans that thus were not really the best encounter you could wish for, not just as a random peasant trying to survive in the general collapse of the world. Think about how even the collective psychology changes in art, the triumph of that and so on, but literally also another man-at-arm that knew perfectly well what they would have been capable of. The etymology of routier is literally the one of route in French, so road, meaning literally people who lived on the highways, a highwayman. So people on the march, on the move, that ravaged like locusts a place after the other, right? The preferential mean of extortion and wealth collection was through the pâtis, that is, protection payments from everyone in the region. The etymology of pâtis comes from the Old French word pastis, or pâtis, meaning pasture or grazing land, derived so in turn from the verb paître, to graze or to feed, which itself traces back to the Latin pascere, to pasture, feed, or nourish. The Latin root is tied to pastoral life, think shepherds and livestock, and shows up in related words like pastor in English or Pascua in Spanish. Regarding of the old etymology, the term seems particularly appropriate considering that, as I've explained in dedicated videos, the mid-14th century crisis brings to an intensification of livestock investments across Europe. This had become somehow more remunerative than certain agricultural practices that had in part collapsed, so they were in the moment also more profitable, reason for which these freebooters would fundamentally milk this resource from the land, taking cattle away. And this is really just the practice of many fringe peoples as well. Think about the Celtic fringe. Arguably that's all they did in their life, killing each other in the process, of course. And so it's relatively typical of not just a predatory lifestyle, but this very specifically critical moment in Western history. The Free Company's typical strategy involved capturing 2 or 3 well-fortified castles to intimidate the surrounding populace and starting to lord over them, terrorizing the peasantry and exacting all this kind of vexations from them. Froissart illustrates this by describing how groups of 20 or 30 brigands, yet another term to define these soldiers, would stealthily set out to raid a town, creating chaos and leading residents to believe in an overwhelming army was attacking. I would like to stress here that this is a particularly French scenario. Like it would happen in other parts of Europe, but the capacity here to substitute yourself to local lords after the collapse of a major, for example, royal force, in areas that historically had never been even to fully and directly controlled, like the southwest of the country. This not quite happening exactly the same elsewhere, right? There could be this kind of ravages, etc., but in other areas, it was a bit difficult for these free companies to normally take over a castle and another, to install themselves there, and literally nobody being able to do anything about this. This happens even in way more fragmented realities like Italy or Germany, that actually do not allow for these guys to properly settle at any level, right? And most of them would actually come back where they had come from without any possibility, even just to install themselves ever, to receive even through extortion or blackmail a fee for title, etc. For example, the Germans are very abusive, very bossy with Denmark, right? At some point, because as we will understand, we have made already some videos on this topic. Most of these company commanders were, needless to say, aristocrats, were men-at-arms, knights, people who, in a way or another, had already some important status. This was the case for all the major protagonists of the era. Again, this is an elite culture in many ways, so even if these were relatively small aristocrats compared to the higher lineages, we're talking a time in history which being an aristocrat was ever more important than it had been before in relative terms to especially the majority of the population was thus subjected, right, to you. Again, there had been a staunch stratification and hierarchization of the nobility at this point. Some of these men were really influential in the bigger picture, but as far as their individual status was concerned, they could afford, in fact, being men-at-arms. That was actually the most lucrative way to live and to seek new opportunities at the service, in fact, of greater lords. And given this state of permanent warfare in large parts of Europe, that didn't really hint at this point to stop, such power vacuums were so important. In France is to exploit, right, for wealth. In France is a bit heaven or hell, depending on how you see it, of course, for this specific dynamic. Like literally becoming these predators, installing themselves in fortresses and terrorizing the local populace, sacking a town after the other. Naturally, the local population wasn't just sitting there, but at large, people were exhausted by the war already, so they were such easy prey. If the townsfolk fled, it was advantageous, of course, for the bandits even to simply loot further what had been left. Once inside the town, they would ransack homes, breaking into chests and taking whatever they wanted before leaving loaded with plunder. Again, not such a plunder that would allow radical enrichment of everybody involved, whatever. There were always ups and downs. There was no easy way to become quickly rich in any time in history, really, especially also considering the fierce competition over resources. In any case, once a region was thoroughly ravaged, they would accept bribes from local inhabitants to move on to new areas, right? In other parts of Europe, like cities would mostly shut their gates, and they would actually let these guys ravage the countryside, but passing just across it and going away, because there was no way they could take on the major fortified centers. This is in part true, of course, in France as well, but not always. Especially considering, again, the collapse of royal authority that, as you know, was the biggest polity in Europe, in the country, and as such, creating greater gaps once absent, literally captured, and taken in exile, to exile like John II. In this context, it's predictable that the French victims of the free commanders refer to all companions as, quote, English, irrespective of the actual nationalities involved. Because in this sort of proto-nationalistic mentality, of course, the enemy is the English, regardless of the fact that many are just, if not Frenchmen, at least Occitanians, to be more precise. But still, of course, England was the boss, manipulating, weaponizing, serving themselves of these local Gascons mostly. And from that specific geographical direction, the southwest, that they had historically occupied, and especially many in the coastal areas, rising up some important riverways like the Garonne, could infest virtually all central southern France. You see there the guy, Basco de Mauléon, arriving up to Avignon, that is technically within the empire. It's between France and the empire on the Rhone, so you arrive up to southeast France, right? Basco observed that such forces, nationally wise, included pretty much everyone in Western Europe, at large English, Gascons, Spaniards, Navarrese, Germans, and Scots. I made some videos explaining why these areas. In part, we're looking at fringe areas or areas that were in crisis or in upheaval, that had all these sort of excess men, youth in search of adventure, that had nothing else to lose and could exploit the destabilization in the neighboring countries, as well as gaining practice in their own, in the same way to loot, plunder, and so on. These are in many ways men of war. Like they're veterans themselves. We don't have to think that the typical royal armies of France and England, while fighting, as we've seen also for the campaign of Poitiers, were different from these troops. At large, the multinational character of the late medieval soldiery was quite pronounced in many ways. It really helped to inform a more homogeneous European military culture, as was really happening. At this point, we'll talk about this for many different areas. But I don't know, the Swiss, for example, were there isn't much about it, but we do know that before their exploit against the Habsburgs, had served in some consistent number in the Italian armies, right? Apparently gaining also some, in fact, this particular infantry capacity is something that the Swiss historiography recognizes about the experience gained in the peninsula. There are also societal phenomena. For example, the ministerialis class that we often discuss in other videos basically has disappeared by this point, because they have become au pair with the rest of the German small aristocracy. Germany is in crisis. I made some videos recently about princely Germany, the further fragmentation of its kingdom. And so the great princes rise, as always. The oligarchs rose. The small aristocrats are losing great part of their liberties. There are many. There are not too many resources around. They go over. They cross the Alps in the rich and fragmented Italy to serve as soldiers. We've seen in the Battle of Poitiers how basically a consistent part of the French army was composed of German men at arms. It also suffered, in fact, in that heavy defeat of the French. We talked about the brutal sort of character of Iberian warfare, especially the Basque areas, but not only the relative primitiveness, again, of Spain compared now to the French, the English. There are these, again, primitives from the Celtic French that are always around, because, again, where is better than, the place where they come from for making a living, and they're pretty radically brutal, underdeveloped people. They're therefore the best for sort of final rank troopers of this kind, accustomed to physical effort, being there under the weather, etc. Other accounts suggest the majority of these, at least French freebooters, freebooters operating in France, were likely Gascons. as we've seen for Mauléon, the same Basco even signifies Basque. The captains were also predominantly Gascons and Englishmen. If you look at mostly this taking over after the Treaty of Bretigny, after the English victory, of course, they are the sort of most obviously involved troops are the ones spreading from the larger English-controlled continental land, irradiating through the various French rivers from the Atlantic watershed pretty much in depth. This is what the Vikings had done historically, but in fact also exploiting the locals for those raids, rising up rivers, devastating the various castles around it. There are so many. Think about the ravaging of the town of Carcassonne outside of the castles. That's also, we'll talk more about the Boucq and how it had evolved historically in a topographic sense, especially in such tendentially feudal countries as Demic settlements, and how they interacted with the defenses and so on. Today we don't even talk about the chevauchée per se. I made a video about the English army organization of the 100 Years' War as far as the chevauchée specifically were concerned. So from there you can understand what they did and how they operated. We'll talk more about the chevauchée in political and strategic terms. You know that the devastations were immense, because virtually after clashes like Poitiers, at this point the southwest is completely left on its own. It's first of all just another country. It has nothing to do with France, if not just from a few generations of royal occupation, but at large it's such a distant place. The French are exhausted. They must maintain control in the north, also with great difficulty. There is war up there as well, so the south is forgotten and brutalized as a consequence. This changes also a lot in terms of international trade routes. The historical Rhone highway that connected the Champagne fairs to the Mediterranean changes. That's why the Genoese opened the Atlantic route. That's why the Venetian opened the Bavarian one. So these places get further impoverished because the traditional trade flow stops passing there. Nobody wants to go there because there is war, there is devastation, and so it's actually a majorly mess. The captains, as we were saying, predominantly being Gascons and Englishmen, hailed in great part from the poorer or landless segments of the smaller aristocracy, the petite noblesse, which explains the prevalence of many Boucqs. It was an actual Gascon title, but equally meaning bastards plural, among their ranks. There are these famous figures of bastards that, as you know, were bastards literally from people of higher status, of particular lineages, that thus were not really raised as random people, but they were powerful themselves. They were also at times loved by their fathers, etc., but they necessarily had to follow another path than one of the official lineage. And there are especially these three figures we will look at now that are the three Boucqs: le Boucq Camus, le Boucq de Breteuil, and le Boucq de l'Espard, who fought in this age, like in the so-called 14 squadrons under Chandos at the Battle of Nájera during the War of Castilian Succession. I made a video about just the outcome of that politically in Castile. We will also make a video about the battle itself. In fact, one group was in this context was even referred to as the Compagnie de Bâtards, so literally the bastards company. Le Boucq Camus, also known as Camus Boucq l'Espard, or simply the Bastard Camus, was a notorious Gascon mercenary captain of Navarrese or Basque origin. His career took off after the Treaty of Bretigny, when Camus joined the Tarvenu, a loose coalition of free companies terrorizing southern France. Froissart describes him as a ruthless operator, pillaging, kidnapping, and torturing for profit. At the Battle of Brignais in 1362, he helped the companies crush a French royal army, showcasing their military clout. By 1367, Camus was at Nájera fighting in the Anglo-Gascon army under the Black Prince, and Chandos supporting Peter of Castile against Henry of Trastamara. His 14 squadrons, part of the vanguard, were a mix of seasoned Gascons and Englishmen, and his reputation for brutality preceded him. He once boasted of throwing prisoners into a fire pit if they couldn't pay ransom. Captured in 1367 at Beauvoir by the Duke of Bourbon's forces, made a video about the House of Bourbon, by the way, if you're interested. His end was as grim as his life. Camus embodied the Free Company's lawless spirit, turning bastardy into a badge of defiance. Le Boucq de Breteuil was another Gascon bastard, likely an illegitimate son of the powerful Lespard family from Gironde, a noble house with deep roots in southern France. Like many of his ilk, he turned to mercenary work when the Treaty of Bretigny halted formal warfare. His early career mirrored Camus's unemployment, drove him to brigandage, roaming the French countryside and extorting towns. He too fought at Brignais in 1362, cementing his status among the Free Companies. At Nájera he commanded troops in Chandos' squadrons, part of the English vanguard that broke Henry's Franco-Castilian lines with longbow volleys and close combat, the typical combined armed tactics of the English armies of the age of Edward III, the 100 Years' War at large. After Nájera, Le Boucq de Breteuil joined other captains like John Hawkwood in the same Italy, hired by Milan's Visconti lords to wage war. I made a video about Florence in the second half of the 14th century a while ago, so you can check that out if you're interested in it, as well as the videos I made on the northern Italian Ghibelline signories armies that really employed this foreign mercenaries at this point in consistent numbers. Le Boucq de Breteuil's illegitimacy barred him from land or titles, but war gave him a stage less flamboyant than Camus. He was still a skilled fighter whose Gascon tenacity shone in battle. His story fades after Italy, but his role at Nájera marks him as a key player among the Compagnie de Bataille. Le Boucq de Lespard, possibly kin to Breteuil, given the shared regional ties, was a Gascon captain from the same Lespard lineage, though details about him are sparser. The name Lespard ties him to the Medoc region, famous one of wine, well, which wine in France is not really, a hotbed of Gascon mercenaries anyway. At Nájera he was among the 14 squadrons, again under Chandos, fighting alongside Camus and Breteuil in the chaotic melee that routed Henry's forces. His presence in this battle suggests he had already built a reputation as leader among the Free Companies, likely through earlier raids or skirmishes post-Bretigny. The Compagnie de Bataille, a unit possibly named for its high number of illegitimate nobles, might have included him as a figurehead or co-founder. Less documented than Camus, his role at Nájera still places him in the thick of the Anglo-Gascon victory. Chandos' herald praises the, quote, good and hardy knights like him who held the line. That's what they had to do, of course. Afterward, he may have followed the mercenary trail to Italy or Spain, though his fate is unclear. His obscurity only deepens the sense of these bastards as shadowy, opportunistic warriors that rose and fall with that ease. By the way, a word about Chandos, because this is such an important figure in the 100 Years' War that we still have to really study in its depth, in its width, but certain figures are kind of like Bertrand du Guesclin, that we will talk about also now, are unavoidable, are unskippable. Sir John Chandos, circa 1370, was a towering figure in the war, an English knight, strategist, and close confidant of Edward III and the Black Prince themselves. Born into a minor gentry family from Redbourne in Derbyshire, Chandos rose through sheer talent and loyalty to become one of the most celebrated military commanders of his era. He's best known for his role in key victories like Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Nájera in 1367, and for his leadership of mixed forces, including the Gascon mercenaries and bastards that we have just discussed. Chandos started young, joining Edward III's retinue by the 40s of the 14th century. At Crécy, he was in the thick of the English triumph over the French, showcasing the devastating combo of longbowmen and dismounted knights, a tactic he'd refined over decades. By 1356, he was a trusted lieutenant to the Black Prince at Poitiers. We looked at his role in the battle. He reportedly advised the audacious flanking maneuver at the end of the clash that won the day, really, leading to the capture of King John II of France. His cool-headedness there earned him a reputation as a master of battlefield improvisation. Knighted and showered with rewards, lands titles, and a hefty pension, he became a founding member of the Order of the Garter in 1348, cementing his status among England's elite. His Gascon connection came into play after the Treaty of Bretigny, when Edward III made him Seneschal of Poitou and later Lieutenant of Aquitaine. Stationed in the Gascony, a fiercely pro-English region, Chandos tapped into the local talent pool. Rugged Gascon nobles and free company captains like Le Boucq, Camus, Porteuil, and L'Espard at Nájera in 1367. He commanded the vanguard for the Black Prince, leading again those 14 squadrons of Anglo-Gascon fighters to smash Henry of Trastamara's Franco-Castilian army. His herald's account, in fact that's why it's called Chandos' Herald, praises his orchestration of archers and men-at-arms, turning a numerical disadvantage into a rout. This victory restored Peter of Castile to the Spanish throne, though it cost England dearly when Peter stiffed them on Paynim. Chandos wasn't just a soldier, he was a fixer. In Gascony, he wrangled unruly mercenaries, negotiated with local lords, and kept the peace, or at least tried to, amid the post-Bretigny chaos. His banner, a silver pile on a red field with a sharp point, became a rallying symbol for his troops. But his end was messy. In 1369, after the war reignited, he was recalled to France during a skirmish at Lussac-le-Château. On New Year's Eve, he slipped on icy ground while chasing French raiders, took a lance to the face, blinding him in one eye. Years earlier didn't help, and died the next day, January the 1st, 1370. Froissart mourned him as the, quote, flower of English knighthood, and even the French respected his chivalry. For the Free Companies, Chandos was both a boss and a lifeline. He harnessed their wild energy at Nájera, giving bastards and routiers a chance to shine under his disciplined command. His death left a void. Without his steady hand, Gascony slid further into disorder. Chandos wasn't flashy like some nobles. He was practical, loyal, and damn good at war, a medieval soldier's soldier. His death exemplifying that, of course, just even the lack of one talented leader could, and even his general presence could really not avoid the general decline of the situation amidst the incredible turmoil that France at all was in the second half of the 14th century. Many of the Free Company's commanders succeeded remarkably well, often because their reigning king of either France or England had to grant them promotions due to the strategic value of the castles they controlled, or their military skills and leadership, as evident by figures like Bertrand du Guesclin. Before passing to him, this aspect is crucial because it really shows that even though we sort of interiorize this period as the age of soldiers of fortune, at large the way these soldiers were employed was not really that different from the one of the previous centuries. We have come to, from one side, sort of almost adopt the same psychological legacy of such dark period, but not really focusing on the broader dimension and also on the comparison with other eras. These troops were part, again, of feudal systems that now have sort of further satellized but still required individual units to guard a given fortress, to have control of a broader province, obviously defending it and or being proactive, passing a counteroffensive against neighboring enemies, etc. Bertrand du Guesclin is definitely one of the most important figures of the 100 Years' War, as probably a very effective military commander. He was born around 1320, died in 1380. He was a Breton knight and definitely one of the greatest French military leaders of the era, often dubbed as the Eagle of Brittany or Black Dog of Brocéliande. Born into a minor noble family near Dinant, Brittany, he was a stark contrast to the polished chivalry of someone like Sir John Chandos. Short, stocky, and famously ugly, chroniclers like Cuvelier didn't mince words about his rough looks. Du Guesclin was a scrappy, relentless fighter who climbed from obscurity to become Constable of France, the kingdom's top military commander. His early years were marked by guerrilla warfare that forged many of these leaders, starting with smaller units, their military career. In the 40s and the 50s of the 14th century, during Britain's Civil War, I made a video about medieval Britain, you can check that out. It was part of the broader 100 Years' War. As you know, he fought for Charles of Blois against the English-backed Montforts, starting with hit-and-run raids, ambushing patrols in the rugged and primitive Breton landscape, seizing castles with small bands. He built a reputation as a master of irregular tactics. By 1357, Du Guesclin caught the eye of the French crown, defending Rennes against an English siege with such tenacity that he became a folk hero. Unlike Chandos, who thrived in pitched battles, Du Guesclin excelled at wearing enemies down, striking where they least expected. Also for Du Guesclin, the big break came after the Treaty of Bretigny, when the Free Companies turned France into a lawless mess. King Charles V, crowned in 1364, tapped Du Guesclin to solve the problem. First, he led the disastrous campaign at Brignais in 1362, where the companies crushed his forces, but he learned fast. By 1365, he hatched a brilliant plan, redirected these restless fighters out of France. Promising loot and glory, he rallied thousands, including some of the very captains who had beaten him, and marched them into Spain to back Henry of Trastamara against Peter of Castile, the same Peter Chandos that had propped up Nájera. It worked. France got breathing room, and Du Guesclin got revenge at the Battle of Montiel in 1369, where Henry killed Peter, securing the Castilian throne. You see how even sending away these companies could really give respite to a system like an individual kingdom. Naturally, there were reasons for going at war in Spain to look better in other videos anyway. This was a byproduct, let's say, of the strategy. Of course, Nájera in 1367 was a low point for the same Du Guesclin, facing Chandos and the Black Prince. Du Guesclin's Franco-Castilian army got hammered, The Saint du Guesclin was captured and ransomed for a kingly sum, showing his worth even in defeat. That's the other typical trait of the period. These commanders are tendentially becoming ever more important, like in a strategic sense in terms of leadership, not just even just from a military point of view, but politically. They had connections with the other captains, even as we've seen the enemy ones. They were charismatic figures. They inspired their troops. Charles V paid this kingly sum gladly for du Guesclin, that by 1370 was named Constable of France, in spite of such debacle. Now he shifted gears. Instead of big battles, he bled the English dry with a Fabian strategy, avoiding direct fights. This is, if you want, the consequence of the English tactical superiority that we're all well aware of for most of the 100 Years' War. We'll make other videos on harassing rather supply lines and reclaiming towns piece by piece. From 1370 to 1380, he reconquered Poitou, Saintonge, and much of Aquitaine, shrinking England's French holdings to a coastal silver. His men loved him for his gritty camaraderie. He wasn't above drinking with peasants or brawling alongside them. Du Guesclin's end came in 1380 while besieging Châteauneuf de Randon. He fell ill, as it was really often the case of death for most of these troops, even more than actual combat, possibly dysentery or a fever, and died on July the 13th, aged about 60. Legend says the garrison surrendered anyway, laying their keys on his corpse as a final salute, even from an enemy. Buried at Saint-Denis among French kings at Charles V's own order, he was mourned as a national savior. Froissart and others praised his cunning over brute force, a stark foil to Chandos' knightly flair. For the free companies, du Guesclin was both nemesis and shepherd. He couldn't crush them head on, so he outsmarted them, exporting their chaos to Spain, then dismantling their Gascon bases later as Constable. Where Chandos led them to glory, du Guesclin turned their strength against England's broader war, fought a rough-hewn tactician with a peasant's heart and a warrior's soul. He was France's bulldog in a war of lions. As we've seen in the case of the Saint Guesclin, many free company commanders would meet grim fates. It wasn't rare at all to get killed in combat, regardless of the elite nature of the men-at-arms that these soldiers essentially fought, as from a condition of leadership. De Mauléon is an interesting figure. He reflected on his own life with the phrase, quote, "By God, it was a good life," told Froissart. And more, "I know very few, except myself, who were not killed in battle somewhere." Right? We will talk at some point about the stats, like what we can reconstruct, but even just telling the history of these individual leaders tells you a lot about their fate. The aforementioned Basco de Mauléon, who reflected on his own life with the phrase, "By God, it was a good life," told Froissart, "I know of very few except myself who were not killed in battle somewhere," which was pretty realistic, especially from a figure like him that, as we noticed, was still alive by his 50s to witness, in fact, the death of less fortunate captains. War wasn't more candid, easier, more chivalric. No, like this was actually grim, brutal. The darkness of those times did reflect, in fact, also in the brutality, the harshness. I think you can relate from today's times, like we didn't think about major wars or acts of incredible brutality. Not being habituated to that makes them seem a big deal. Then we oddly, as sinisterly, get habituated almost to it, to moral shock, especially if we're detached from that in a way or another. But historically, you can perceive how something is relatively new, or there is an intensification of such brutality, such bloodshed. And this was the case in this era. Also because in chaos, like you could have, let's say, a more, let's say, maybe less bloodbaths in interest of times. I mean, actually, the 100 Years' War, because of this major contendence, would bring to pretty large-scale battles for the time standards. They weren't enormous, however, compared to the ones of previous generations that we think a bit less, because they're not part of the 100 Years' War. It was much more popularized. But it's the attritional, sort of random dimension of this all, this relentless operational activity across wide territories that would bring to so many unpredictable engagements where even, of course, leaders at large were often not so, in fact, in charge of larger forces to cultivate greater capacities in strictly art of war terms, because this is also a factor we must consider. These captains were leading, yes, professionals, but also people that, in this sense, were not enough just to be major armies, just per se, most of the times. But that's how, in fact, random that could be, given the absence of even an end to this all. How their entire life was framed within such dark and bloody journey. Furthermore, the legal ambiguities surrounding free companies frequently led to executions following the captain's capture, even when they were serving under legitimate authorities, which they often were. Let's not, see these as, okay, they were mercenaries in this kind of either Machiavellian or also 19th century nationalist statalist sense, like this were mercenaries was something else. They weren't mercenaries, they were soldiers, just like the ones in the Middle Ages had been up to this point. In fact, they were increasingly more professional, that this was happening at a time of lesser political control, indeed, but also the collapse of largely defined national forces at this, to the scale that was normally used before, does not mean that these were, like privateers, say, during the Renaissance. There were also at this time similar figures, and of course there were people serving, as we've seen, switch inside, and it was completely normal already. But exactly in this sense, we're talking very often of soldiers that would have been considered as such, just like they could have been considered 100 years before, because they literally performed the same function contractually, strategically. On the contrary, at this point, there was even a better definition of the strictly negotiable relation. Think about the intentur, the condotta, we start having the actual contracts, right? This already existed from quite a while, but there is all a process during the crisis that brings, in the later Middle Ages, paradoxically, to increase documentation, to sort of become a bit more modern and secular as far as these connections were. In the past, they may have been even wilder, like knights errant were even sort of less connected to a specific rule. So it's also the way we came to think these ages, because of the more positive or negative undertones that we give to the respective narratives that sometimes makes us picture them in what turns out to be an historically inaccurate way, or simply a subjectively biased one. But this was yet another cause of that, like being executed for treason, for whichever political point. The size of individual companies usually ranged from a few hundred to fewer than 100 men, at least if we talk about France. And there were bigger companies that would be counted in the thousands, that in fact were a bit of a bigger thing. The company, the compagnia, so those that share bread, like it's a term used from quite a long time in Latinate Europe, is like the Haupt and the Hauptmann. There are some the Capitaneus. Again, these are all terms that across Europe, depending on the on the linguistic background are very sort of standard terms. Historically, companies had been, in fact, even down to a few tens of men, the process through which bands of knights got to associate together and to sell their military service to the highest bidder, just to their lord in sort of a more autonomously functional way, is pretty old. We documented this, especially starting from the 13th century, when in fact specific phenomena, just like the same condotta, appeared, at least even in a strictly documentary sense, because the thing might have been older, did witness bands of tens of men, but they would soon grow, especially in the second half of the 13th century, in the hundreds. And when we look at larger companies, we realize that they were actually the sum of smaller companies. So the ones that had usually been, in fact, at a company level, just like it's used today in military, the official military or organic, that perform a very specific tactical function. And these broader companies are some kind of regiments, so to say, and so they have also on the battlefield a bigger relevance. But we look at especially the fragmentation of the free companies operating in France. We see definitely smaller contingents. That's also why this history is probably relatively overrated, even from a strictly military point of view, if it weren't for the width of the phenomenon. And also reflecting in this sense likely the fact that there was enough in this big exhausted France a bit for many smaller, say more fragmented forces could scatter themselves across the territory, having each one their own share. But let's not make it even so easy for them at all, because companies cost. All right, you have to move, you have to travel, and so sometimes you live off the land. This was really typical. And when you come back, you barely even have too much more than you had before, without counting the losses. And in fact, you must have, in fact, engaged with the enemy, rolling the dice, even risking to be annihilated as a company as well. Some of these people would at least survive, but maybe their units wouldn't, and so companies would form, reform, vanish, etc. In 1364, records indicate there were 400 companions divided among 4 captains, which is not a lot, frankly. If you look at the broader amount of forces, even just the major battles of the era, that are not so big, again, compared to the previous generations, incredibly overlooked aspect in our, again, pop narration of military history. By the way, clashes of the 100 Years' War that even that are remembered as the most important of the period, but weren't even that big numerically wise. And there is, of course, specific English-French focus, mostly Western historiography, mostly dominated again by the Anglosphere ever since World War II, that in this sense does not render justice to other areas of Europe, but again, we will get there. In any case, this history must be said. It's not like you have to neglect it. England, France at this period are really what you must study, including this phenomenon. This scarcity of number, even Sir Robert Knolles, one of the most illustrious captains of the Routiers, and recognized by the chronicler Jean Lebel as one of the earliest, reportedly commanded only 600 men in his company, according to one source. Consider that we're talking 600 men, of which just a narrow, maybe 100 are men at arms, right? There are more heavy elements, but also lots of skirmishers, raiders, and so on. Froissart claims that in 1369 the same Knolles had 500 archers, in fact, an equal number of foot soldiers and 60 men at arms. So, again, a bit more than 1,000, half of which were fundamentally light troops. So we're talking about very modest contingents, as we've noticed in the video about the English armies of the chevauchée in the 100 Years' War. Sir Robert Knolles is yet another name whose military curriculum is interesting to browse. Knolles, spelled sometimes with Y or E, or even as Knolles, born roughly around 1325, died in 1407, remarkably long life for the time and especially the profession, was in fact, formidable English soldier and captain during the 100 Years' War, a contemporary of figures like the aforementioned Chandos and Guesclin, a key player among the free companies, hailing from Cheshire, likely born into a humble yeoman stock rather than nobility. This is also relatively exceptional. Knolles clawed his way up through sheer martial talent and opportunism, becoming one of the war's most feared and wealthy commanders, showing that in spite of the crisis, some lucky, capable, and really a determined leader could even rise in a consistently social sense from a humbler background to very high levels. Think of him, Knolles, as a self-made medieval warlord, ruthless, resourceful, and unshackled by the chivalric pretensions of high-born knights that he had to fight in addition to his foes. Knolles first pops up in the 40s of the 14th century, fighting in Brittany during its civil war, a proxy confrontation. By 1346 he was at the Battle of Crécy under Edward III, likely as an archer or junior officer, honing the skills that defined him. Tactical nous and knack for leading rough men. His real rise came in the 50s, serving under Chandos and the Black Prince at Poitiers, so other protagonists of that clash, where the English again routed the French, captured John II. Knolles didn't grab headlines there, but he soaked up the chaos and the profits of war, mastering the art of ransom and plunder. After the Treaty of Bretigny, when peace left soldiers like Basco de Mauléon jobless, Knolles seized the moment. He became a free company leader, heading a band of English, Gascon, and Breton fighters known as the Compagnie Blanche, so the White Company, not to be confused, however, with John Hawkwood's later Italian outfit. These weren't knightly idealists. They were hardened pros who turned France into their personal ATM. Some degree, the level of brutality and ruthlessness was very, very high. In 1360-61, Knolles ravaged the Loire Valley and the same Ile-de-France, showing how vulnerable at that point the French monarchy really was. The Jacquerie had occurred, like there had been the issue of ransoming the same king. So again, I also made a video about peasant revolts. These were essentially the populations who felt literally now defenseless to this in-depth offensives into the same French national heartland. So an incredibly delicate situation, from which, however, France still survived. Knolles men sacked towns and extorted patis, as we've seen, so this essentially protection money as well. This is to say, you will not be touched, at least if you give me what I could extract in other ways, keeping things tidier, cleaner, like a medieval mob boss, which was, again, how normally the feudal system had affirmed itself, but here we're looking at a phase of, again, public decline, degradation of the system that is shrinking but does not die, and actually France, as you know, will again strike back at a point not before so much was suffered, though. Knolles men torched Auxerre and got within spitting distance of Paris itself, forcing locals to pay up or burn. Chroniclers pegged Knolles as a terror. Froissart called him a, quote, cruel and enterprising captain. His big solo gig came in 1370 when Edward III, desperate to counter du Guesclin's gains, sent Knolles to lead a chevauchée, a scorched earth raid into northern France. Again, with 2,000 to 3,000 men, which was not a few. at this, as we've seen by the standards of these free companies, Knolles torched the countryside from Calais to Paris suburbs, aiming to provoke the French into a fight. But his co-commander, Sir Hugh Calblay, bickered with him, splitting their force. Du Guesclin, now constable of France, pounced, ambushing Knolles' scattered troops at Pont-Valin. Knolles slipped away. His survival instincts were sharp, but the fiasco stained his record. Still, he'd already banked enough loot to shrug it off. Unlike Chandos, who served royal strategy, or Du Guesclin, who fought for France's soul, Knolles was a mercenary at heart, loyal to England but driven by cash. He didn't join Chandos at Niger in 1367. He was too busy raiding France himself. But his free company days overlapped with Gascon bastards like the aforementioned Le Boucq Camus, sharing the same post-Bretigny playbook. His wealth piled up by the 70s. He owned estates across England, Brittany, and Wales, and funded a Chantry College in Cheshire, which you may also want to consider given this person's background. It was just, a way of living that did not exclude also his other interests. He even rebuilt his hometown church, St. Julian's, with war profits, a rare nod to piety. Knolles' later years were quieter. He advised Richard II in the 80s. I made a little video about part of his reign. Also led a failed Flanders campaign in 1381 and crushed rebels during the Peasants' Revolt in England, which also had been suffering these issues. I mean, England was winning the major battles and at this point having sort of an easier time than France, but overall, the 100 Years' War was extremely costly for England as well. Had they lost one of the major battles that they marvelously won, they would have probably collapsed themselves. So it was actually a very delicate balance there. Married to Constance Beverley, Knolles left no heirs when he died in 1407 at 80 plus, which, as we've seen, is really rare for a medieval warrior. Buried in London's Whitefriars, his legacy is his meteoric rise from Cheshire obscurity to a knight with a fortune, all without noble blood. His badge, a ram's head. Traditionally, we know what that means, the virginal force of the Apollo Phoebus rebooting the new Aethas, right, through military action, molding the world in his own image, fitting his stubborn, battering ram style. For the free companies, Knolles was a poster boy, a low-born man who turned war's anarchy into gold, outlasting flashier peers like Chandos and outfoxing, at least sometimes, foes like Du Guesclin. He wasn't a hero or a villain, just a survivor, in many ways, who played the game better than most. And the various companions, so to say, these free captains engaged for service in as far as Spain between 1365 and 1366, organizing themselves for the occasion into groups of up to 200 men, which of course mirrors some kind of more serious organization necessary, if anything, because of the logistical challenges of operating more distantly and having invested more altogether. Union makes strength. Naturally, Spain had its logics and dynamics, multiple sides, not just a pair, but it was still a foreign land where you had to be really careful where you stepped into, even as a captain commander. And this would bring, in part, to the standards that the same Spanish would come to imitate from the French, from the English, during the Castilian War of Succession, from a much more sort of backward feudal background that had not really kept up with the military developments with the rest of Western Europe up to that point. But that would in fact align to those Franco-English standards. 200 men, each under the command of a single captain. Meanwhile, the 3,000 companions who participated in the battle at Montauban in 1366 were divided into companies of 3 and 400, suggesting that groups of such dimension were actually the most common size. The most important point here, organically wise, is not much how sort of big or small these units were, but the fact that despite their also relatively small numbers, because again, it's not like they were fighting alone, especially out there in the open, but in major engagements it would be grouped with other forces, as we've seen. All companies now exhibited structure command hierarchies that comprised some sort of permanent ranks and personnel, also as field aides, organizers, etc., comprising constables, marshals, trumpeters, secretaries, treasurers, and even boutonniers, who were those individuals responsible for distributing loot according to a set protocol, because sharing the spoils had, we know better since Clovis times and much before, think the Iliad, just making further leap backward, caused major discipline issues, which, especially when you're out there on your own, say in a chevauchée hundreds of kilometers in depth into enemy territories, are really your greatest enemy, right? The more divided you are, the more vulnerable you are. And this aspect of further professionalizing hierarchy, internal structure, organization, is typical of the era. It shows you how, regardless of these broader civilizational shortcomings, the potential incapacity for starting to actually continuing to build and rebuild the same civilization from the bottom up was always there, right? Differently from late antiquity, it's not like late Middle Ages crisis brought to a collapse or a major fall of civilization. On the contrary, it stimulated, spurred ever more regulated and controlled systems, thanks to the aforementioned oligarchization, hierarchization, that also bring actually public authority further ahead, especially in Western Europe. That's also why we're looking at these areas. As we've seen, the Franco-English models are very high military-wise. Some armies like the White Company, that again today unfortunately we don't discuss, but we will in depth at some other point, really represent the finest forces out there, regardless of this apolid behavior. The fact that they were not to evolve into anything more permanent, unless we talk about anonymous companies that, yes, at some point towards the mid-14th century are not disbanded anymore for the bad season, mostly in France. But this had already happened. Again, we were talking about it before. The Italians had a long experience of that already, especially since the beginning of the 14th century. And at large, what you notice here is a strengthening, a standardization, a compaction of companies, and the fact that that fluidity of the previous years, at least that deformity, that heterogeneity in military organization was now not really coming to an end, but was at least slowing down around the consolidation of these more professional and stable units. Then there would be, as we were saying before, disbanded. Some wouldn't really have a future. In many ways, these were constituted ad hoc. Right, but the fact that you would provide yourself with a treasury, with an administration, with probably the mentality of just going out there as a business, as an enterprise, as long as this was feasible, etc., really shows very high levels of organization. We've seen it better because this actually evolves further, mostly in the condottieri of especially the native Italian ones that start now being nearly the totality from the 70s and the 80s, and that's why we treat them in other videos. We will have to make really a lot of them, because those will become literally statal armies, right? In countries, as we've seen, like France, it would be something relatively similar, even though that later on there would be properly ordinances that are something more nationwide, organized by the monarchy rather. So it's a different story. It's not by way like the traditional forms of recruitment are completely dead, right? It's just they integrate now this core of professionals, of mercenaries, if you prefer, that will remain typical of the Ancien Regime in many ways, at least up to the sort of the second modern age, and the rise properly of national armies, at least as prevalently public statal armies, regardless of how subcontracted they were to various noblemen, but fundamentally uniformed and truly royal, in the referring to the nature of a single country. So that's another age, but up to that point, this is fundamentally the structure that takes place here by the mid-14th century will remain across essentially 300 years, right, as the most viable in Europe. And practically the more of these mercenaries you had, and the more professional soldiers you've actually had, right, next to, again, a core of royal national forces, you have these guys plus some levies, and of course they could be very foreign at a point, coming from different countries at a time, still serving in an adequate way. What you see here is just a moment of greater disorder or chaos, but even in here you find the embryo of something more solid and robust taking shape. Additionally, many companies had a clerk de patis in this French context to collect, in fact, the aforementioned payments. There are similar episodes in the Italian companies. For example, Fra Moreale's management of Werner von Urslingen's great company included an advisory council, judges, a chamberlain, a provost marshal, and even a mobile gallows. These are different figures. There are, however, for example, it's very common for companies at this point to all employ their own farriers, saddlers, surgeons, and cooks. So they literally hire craftsmen, specialists, as if they were a floating, a traveling mini state, even though, of course, like something really contained, as we've seen, just mostly a few hundred, sometimes thousands of troops. Before concluding today, because we will have to talk about many other such leaders in another video, we mentioned briefly these figures mostly operating, or at least becoming more famous for operating in Italy. All right, one is Fra Moreale. So we were talking Fra Moreale and Werner von Urslingen. The first one had commanded the great company, we will see it now, across Italy. Essentially, these were, as we'll see now, unpaid veterans who were thrown in between, say, various communal leagues until they were finally expelled from Italy, and reflecting that very manipulative way that basically explains what was going on. It's not just like these companies had arrived in the region and began to dictate rule. Actually, they couldn't really go elsewhere. They just tour around. They can't settle anywhere, and they're pressured by this or that nobleman to either be their allies or attacking somebody else's countryside. Eventually disbanding, coming back largely to Germany, because they were largely Germans. But you have these other groups, the Bretons. Again, we will have to discuss this at some point. But Fra Moreale is a key a bit to that aspect, together with Werner von Urslingen. Fra Moreale was born Montreal dal Barno. He was born around 1310, and he died in 1354, so we're slightly earlier in time. Just think about times where still there were some of the largest armies ever seen. but these guys would have been 5 by the time of the Battle of Montecatini, where fellow Occitanian connationals would be butchered by the Ghibelline forces of Uguccione in his German mercenaries and peasant crossbowmen. So their mindset was, again, coming from this mentality we still have today. We have seen what the greatness of the before. Now we're going through the crisis, and we kind of adapt in very ruthless ways sometimes. Fra Moriale, which is the Italian name given to him in the peninsula, was a Provençal knight of the Hospitalier order, by the way, who turned from holy vows to mercenary mayhem. Very similar to Roger de Flor. We talked about, in fact, the Catalan Grand Company that caused issues in the east, but also had emerged from post-Swabian context in southern Italy, the War of the Vespers between the Aragonese, the Angevins. They're all chapters we must cover in much greater depth, because they are major pages in military history. Fra Moriale's early life is murky, but by 1347 he was in Naples with Werner von Urslingen, fighting for Louis of Hungary. We talked about this in the video about 13th century Hungary. We talked about this in the video about Angevin Naples. It will come back on it as well. This was a fully sort of free companies of reality already, or at least that was a civil war in Naples, with Queen Joanna, and actually the crossing from Hungary was quite smooth because the Italians let him pass towards Naples. Now, after Werner split off Moriale's state, right, growing the Great Company, we'll talk about this later, we'll talk about Urslingen, right, but for Fra Moriale, he sort of, it's relevant because he turned it into a juggernaut. Like by 1353-54, he boasted 10,000 fighters and 20,000 followers, so much bigger force than what we've seen in France, which, by the way, tells you, among the other things what we were saying before, that if you move away a bit from this self-referential idea that whatever was happening between France and England is the center of medieval warfare of the year, you realize actually that in places like Italy, in this case, armies were still bigger and better organized, and we decided to skip it for some reason that is really unexplainable by 2025. So the Great Company was also called for like this for a reason, was that mobile state we defined before, with its own bureaucracy, lawyers and priests, plus prostitutes for good measure. Just yesterday I was talking about the last aspect for World War I trench lifestyle, right? So certain things sort of never change, settler trains. Fra Moriale ran the Great Company like a corporation, essentially, splitting plunder methodically among his men, a far cry from the loose bands of earlier decades, so actually showing how much more advanced this broader context really was, also in a disciplinary sense. Moriale's reign was peak free company chaos, at least rage, so we could say. He plundered central Italy, banking huge profits in the early 50s of the 14th century. Matteo Villani, the continuator of his famous brother's chronicler from Florence, notes soldiers flocking to Fra Moriale, ditching other gigs for his loot-heavy outfit. In 1354, Fra Moriale rode into Rome to collect a debt tied to his brother's loan to Cola di Rienzo, Rome's cash-strapped tribune. I made a video about him, and recently we talked about Charles IV of Bohemia, so Rienzi's role in Prague and also with the Avignon papacy, etc. Cola broke and, desperate at that point, ambushed and beheaded him instead, a move that shocked contemporaries despite Moriale's cutthroat rep. Right, Froissart's ilk still saw him as a knight, not just a thug. His dying protest, "Don't you see, I'm a knight," rings almost tragic. And what the Romans were doing at that point was something very, in part populistic, but also sort of inspired to the idea that there had to be a republican government of sort, which wouldn't see in that sense knights. Actually, the very powerful baronial houses of Rome were behind such schemes, but in theory, like the force of the people, even against the knights, was strong. And after his death, Conrad von Landau took over the great company, keeping it rolling. What I always found it funny is how the Italians vernacularized their names. Conrad von Landau became the Conte Lando, by the way, which is yet another important, in fact, free captain, German captain. Morales' career, to wrap it up, like ties less directly to the 100 Years' War than Werner von Urslingen's foundational influence, but the timing's telling. His peak came just as Bretigny-Truss lost similar companies in France, right? So he set the precedence. His great company, bloated with veterans from various wars, mirrored the Tagvenus of Knolles' bands, professional, predatory, and indifferent to crowns. Bertrand du Guesclin later herded such men to Spain. Think about the military experience gained in all these theaters of war at the time. Were men that had been fighting in all places: France, Spain, Italy. Maybe they were from Germany or England. So it's not like in those countries just nothing was going on. So it's really a pan-European military identity. This is reflected also in, the contemporary arms and armor, as everything is becoming ever more uniform, ever more standardized. Europe is ever more intertwined, especially after the crisis. Paradoxically, elite contacts are much wider and intense, so that especially this armor is very much afforded elsewhere. I made a video about Milanese armor, really ahead of the entire system, not just in terms of material quality, technical quality, but also business model, right? So that everything here is ever more complex, ever more at hand. Let's say that what Bertrand du Guesclin did in Spain was a trick he might have cribbed from Morales' own scale of operation. Other crucial figure, of course, already mentioned, is Werner von Urslingen. Born around 1308, right, very early, died in the same year of Fra Morale. He was a Swabian knight from the noble Urslingen family, possibly descended from the Dukes of Spoleto. I made a video about the Duchy of Spoleto that, as you know, remained before being finally absorbed by the papal government. Sort of a island of Ghibellinism into central Italy on at least the Adriatic watershed, but the hinterland quite close to Rome, that routinely witnessed German figures placed by emperors on the throne. We don't know about Werner, but it's possible that such connections did exist, as German knights had, however, always been around in Italy, either as invaders or mercenaries, or even subjects of some sort, especially in southern Italy during the Hohenstaufen rule. And in any case, Werner became one of the earliest and most infamous mercenary captains in Italy, for many reasons. His motto, supposedly etched on his breastplate, was "Enemy of God, of Pity and Mercy." So a grim banner for a man who lived by plunder and extortion, and that was very accurate, even probably reflecting some of this commander's mentality. It could be countercultural. As we've seen, Knolles would even found churches, etc. These guys instead were kind of more brutal. Like, being born and rising in Germany at the beginning of the 14th century is not really a particularly delicate life experience, let's put it in this way. One day I made just recently a very appreciated video about knightly combat psychology. We'll keep talking about this because you must understand the background of these people, not just what they went through during their training or during their military exploit, but even just from birth. like, who were these people? Like, where had they emerged from? Like, as lords, what was their training? What was their mentality? What they want to achieve? This is incredibly important. There was a lot of politics involved in this. It's never just loot, per se. Starting in the 30s of the 14th century, Urslingen fought for Venice against Verona. This is at the time of Florence and Venice alliance against the La Scala. And then he joined Lodrisio Visconti's Compagnia di San Giorgio, tasting defeat at Parabiago in 1339. These were essentially the German veterans of the Florentine, Venetian, in part also Scaliger mercenaries that at the end of the war were just, okay, you're on your own. And so they went on to Milan, fighting a civil war that had broken out because of a dynastic dispute between the Visconti and greatly, essentially, the usurper that was trying to come back to Milan, as he had been expelled from there, hired these guys, and he attacked the city, and instead the Milanese, together with some allies from northern Italy, crushed these Germans, some of which went out there. There is the famous Malerba, that was a guy who made a vow after that to go fight against the Turks at the Crusade of Smyrna in Turkey, where he died. You have all these very interesting stories, very interesting chronicling passages. Some of these Germans, after capture, were actually hired by the same Milanese, so it went on under the Visconti. By 1342, after a stint with peace against Florence, Urslingen founded the Great Company, a rowing army of essentially German, Italian, and other adventurers, numbering around 3,000 men at arms at its start. This was bigger, because as we've seen, actually Italian armies were bigger compared to the French, to the English ones very often during this era. So that's something we'll have to look at even better in detail some other times. Werner's Great Company didn't mess around with chivalric ideals anymore. That's why the dark counter-culture of the era emerges at this point. He ravaged Tuscany, Umbria, and Romagna. That's what made that tour, where he had left, essentially being, put aside by Florence. He passed through these more fragmented areas that allowed him from these ravagings, but without stopping, without actually having any broader staying like aspirations. On the contrary, being constantly pressured by these various city-states to go against one another, shaking down cities like Siena and Assisi for cash to at least to facilitate the transit, his transit from their lands. He flipped allegiances as fast as the paychecks came, supporting Francesco Ordelaffi against the Papal States in Romagna, then taking bribes from Malatesta to switch sides in the same province. In 1347, King Louis I of Hungary hired him to invade Naples, avenging his brother's murder there, Andrew, and he linked up with Fra Moreale, the aforementioned Provençal knight, and won big at Mileto in 1349, pocketing 500,000 florins in loot, which was big, really, 500,000 florins, at least for what we understand, and managing to compensate for much of the losses. Just consider a single city could cost several tens of thousands of florins. But all this was somehow ephemeral, with, by 1351, with contracts drying up, Werner retired to Swabia, dying 3 years later. His great company lived on, as we've seen, passing to Moreale's hands. Werner's link to the 100 Years' War was indirect, but real, right? As we've seen, what had been pioneered in Italy in such a lawless fashion would be even more intense in France. Werner's model of a self-sustaining mobile mercenary force set a pattern that echoed across Europe, influencing the routiers who plagued France post-treaty. But again, with those specificities that we were hinting at before, this company was really guided by bigger powers, and at the end of the day did not really go anywhere, did not settle down, did not achieve some greater status, on the contrary. And so when you look at Werner and Morale as architects of the great company, you realize that not just, yes, their mercenary machine outlived them both, but say Werner built it from scratch, proving war could be a freelance gig. Morale scaled it into a proto-corporate empire. Neither fought in France's 100 Years' War heartland, but their free company model, born in Italy's patchwork of city-states, prefigured the routiers who'd honed France post-Brittany. Men like Knolles and Basco de Mauléon owed something to their playbook: live off the land, extort the weak, and thrive in pieces cracks. It was this gap, right, that really allowed them to carry out these enterprises. In part, this is true also in France, right? There the thing appears bigger because of this apparent lack of any contrast, even for smaller armies. But at large, in fact, what say bigger armies could employed in similar ways could sort of suggest to them was well imitated. So for today I would actually stop it here, because really I'm not sure whether to make 2 or 3 episodes of this, because the histories of these guys are very fascinating, as you understand. Free companies are difficult to tell if, I would say, you teach their history without context. If you've just seen them, this triumph of disorders, they have been too often described like in actually just some, instead of poems, of some bigger mechanism of power, sponsored by bigger polities that still held sway, after all, in the control of these military resources. Right? States did not end, monarchies did not end, order did not end in this regard. It's a lack of order. It's the darkest era of Western civilization since, let's say, the first centuries of the Middle Ages. It's a shattering from which, however, Europe reemerges reinforced with stronger military models that will essentially not allow for this phenomenon anymore. We made a couple of videos about the German peasants' revolt in the beginning of the 16th century that basically has nothing anymore of these movements. By the way, what we've seen here was occurring, we mentioned before, in parallel with France, France's Jacquerie, and the French military, the French Jacquerie, the English peasant revolt. So something that was incredibly different from this system, because these were professional soldiers, the others were peasants, and the latter went nowhere, where the former were reabsorbed in the system fundamentally of much more advanced militaries. And just, you can't say the next day, but during the same day, paradoxically, meaning that, again, if you look at, as we will do, at we have already done, at the military of the local powers, as we've seen the same France, the Italian powers, so we realized that there was a sound authority there, and that, again, these freebooters could exist because there were some wars between these powers that could allow these gray areas and further manipulating this temporarily jobless mercenaries. Still, again, it's as if they had been at their service against one another. And if one reads it in this way, I think history makes much more sense. It's much clearer. It's much more understandable. It really makes much more sense politically and militarily. I really dislike this notion that the Middle Ages should be seen as some sort of moment in which people were randomly doing whatever they wanted. The Middle Ages are beautiful in virtue of traditional discipline, hierarchy, order, status, and these very companies could have not existed hadn't they been the expression of military systems that were already dramatically advanced and that we tend to somehow weirdly belittle in front, especially of numbers that can be hardly equivocated. What I always say in these videos, look at the size of armies at the end of the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th century. And look at the size of armies now. And yet, it's of the armies now, yes, but also of the permanence of the military model in the biggest powers in Europe, regardless of any crisis, of any defeat like the major French ones during 100 Years' War, and realize how that military model stayed there, even in the darkest hour. Like, for example, the Jacquerie was a big thing. You don't have something like this, I don't know, in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, even in England, where you have the peasant revolt, but even in Flanders or Italy, when there is the salaried workers revolts in the cities, none is so threatening like in France, and yet France still maintains, after all, that order. The Jacquerie is brutally repressed. It doesn't actually allow for definitive, decisive advances on the same fronts. This is especially true for this first period, because, as you know, the major problem for the French monarchy would actually occur at the beginning of the 15th century after Azincourt, which we will definitely take a look at in the future. I don't know when, it's so really random whenever these battles emerge from the cycle. But as you understand, this would not really make much sense hadn't we delineated this background, this picture. Right. So for me, as Schwerpunkt is concerned, it's extremely important to cover everything, to cover every single name, every single battle, every single company. It's sometimes you do it just in a superficial way because, again, you don't have all the time in the world, but given that not just I'm studying the period in part for my work, but that there is always so much you can look at in depth, more in depth, as we are gradually doing. You know that if you follow me on a regular basis, well, definitely everything can be compacted in a way that honestly I've never seen here on YouTube, and that instead can really be beneficial for everybody involved. That's the point of the channel, that's the point of discussing these figures. And we'll talk about more commanders, more captains, because these are names that just must be remembered as relatively ephemeral, because now we've seen the bigger names, then we'll look at also smaller figures. But what matters is really recomposing the mosaic, so that you can understand what was happening at this point, that other, and the more videos you watch and the more you're able to look at this more in depth. By the way, I have also a 100 Years War playlist that I'm looking forward to update. This video, for example, will go into it, but just like most of the ones I've already made, it's never like, or it's rarely at least like, a full video about the 100 Years War specific events, major events of the 100 Years War. We have to really, let me check, 100 Years War, to look at to cover some of the major events, but the 100 Years' War is also so messy, telling the truth. Exactly in the way it's sort of difficult to simply recompose. Here we have essentially 12 videos. This is the 13th, and we have the Bio or Bayonne video. These are not even technically just about the 100 Years' War. The first one is State Building in the 100 Years' War, an overview. This is an old video. France and England after the 100 Years' War, development and conclusion of the 100 Years' War, the beginning of the 100 Years' War, English field army strength of the 100 Years' War, French army organization of the 100 Years' War, Battle of Poitiers in 2 videos, coats of arms of the 100 Years' War, armor of Sir George Felbridge, which you want to consider from the parish church of Playford, County Suffolk, 1400 roughly, the grab plate. And the first permanent nucleus of the French Royal Army that doesn't even technically talk only about the 100 Years' War, but naturally encompasses it. And so you see hardly any specific, like here, this video is about the Free Companies, but it's not specific about the 100 Years' War. Actually, it's happening in a gap of the 100 Years' War, but it's baked into it as well. So, yeah, that's by approximation. The 100 Years' War is not just a war, but conventionally we can intertwine it with all these other elements. Naturally, this is it. We will complete this in another time. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.